All right, what's up, guys? A few questions have come up on this idea of the 80% rule, the 4/5 analysis, stuff like that. So I want to take a few minutes. We're going to walk through it. It's one of the most basic calculations that we do in terms of tracking data that comes in. So with that in mind, we'll get after it. It's called the 80% rule. It's also called the 4/5 rule or the 4/5 analysis. One of the problems, right, with those titles is it simplifies something that can be oversimplifies something that can be a little bit complex. The math is really easy, but understanding what we're doing behind the math is what actually kind of matters. So let's get into it here. It's really about testing for evidence of discrimination. The key word here is there statistical evidence for adverse impact? If there is, it doesn't mean there necessarily is adverse impact or there's disparate treatment or anything like that. It just means that that's a really key piece of evidence that tells you as the HR manager what's going on. And fortunately or unfortunately, it also tells the judge and jury what's going on. So at a high level, so you might be interested in, okay, we're doing selection, we're doing promotion, we're doing redeployment, layoffs, RIFs, we're hiring people from outside, we're putting people in management trainee programs, we're paying people, right, compensation rates. So we just want to know, like, there's lots of different sources of data. Is there evidence that there's adverse impact anywhere within our organization? Remember, there's two different things here. One of them is disparate treatment or adverse treatment. One of them is disparate impact. Disparate treatment is usually at the individual level. And it's usually pretty obvious, not always, but it's provable. Disparate impact, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, it comes from a policy that's been written or a practice that's been done that unintentionally, disparately impacts a particular group of people, a particular protected class, which is why we call it disparate or disparate impact. It's also called adverse impact because it adversely affects them. So why would you want to do this? Why would you want to know? To start with, it's a traditional HR metric, right? It tells us what's going on. It also predicts success rate in lawsuits. If someone says, hey, there's this policy and it unfairly discriminates against fill in the blank, whatever protected class, maybe women, for instance, you can go, okay, well, here's the data. And the data suggests that it actually doesn't disparately impact women. That's a big win in a lawsuit. Provides data for managing diversity. A lot of times people say, hey, we want to manage diversity better. Well, start with the data. Like, how are you doing right now? That'll tell you. And when there are complaints about some kind of an HR process or system, it's usually a complaint about a lack of equity or a lack of justice. This doesn't prove that the process is good, but it can show if the process is working in a disparate way or not. This came from 1978, the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures. So as all things considered history and the timeline, right, you have Executive Order 11246 in 1963. You have the Civil Rights Act, Title VII laws, what we refer to them as in 1964 during the Civil Rights era, and then some tweaks to it in 1991. But in 1978, we've had 15, 14 years of the Civil Rights Law. And people are saying, how do we know? Like if we go to court or if we just want to know if we're breaking the law, is there a way to do that? And if we select men at a rate of 50% of one of every two men that apply, we hire them, and one of every three women that we apply that apply, we hire them. Is that bad? Is that good? Like, what's the actual line? So it's not just a subjective, judgment call each time. So they came out with this rule. The 4/5 rule, and it kind of basically says, look, if we are promoting men at a rate of 50%, what would we expect the promotion rate for women to be? Well, 50%. What if it's 51%? What if it's 49%? Is that okay? Sure. What if it's 45%? Is that okay? Well, what if it's 10%? Well, that's probably too far. So where do we draw the line to say, at this point, if it's below X number, then it looks like there's statistical evidence to suggest there's adverse impact. That line is 80% or 4/5. So at whatever rate you're hiring men, at whatever rate you are promoting white, then every other category should be around the same rate. There shouldn't be a big gap in between those categories. So here's the key verbiage. It's down at the bottom here. if the selection rate of a minority or a protected class group is less than 80% of the selection rate for the majority group, there's statistical evidence for adverse impact. So if I have a management trainee program and I have 100 white applicants that apply, and I take 30 of them, and I have 100 non-white applicants that apply, and I take 15 of them, we'd say, well, that's 50%. You selected the non-white group at a rate of 50% of the applicants versus the 30, 15 out of 30. Let me show you some data. We use this across all kinds of different platforms. Those we interview, pass rates for selection tests, performance appraisal ratings, salary, promotion, demotion, everything. So you can track this everywhere. Okay, there are two different types we need to distinguish here. Two different types of this analysis. One of them, and they don't have formal names, so I just call it internal selection versus external selection. You've probably heard of the idea of an availability analysis, and that just means what we have in our company looks like what we have out there. So if you live in a labor market for a job that's 60% men in the labor market, what would you expect in your company? Well, about 60% men. You know, what if it's 50% men? Okay. What if it's 70% men? You expect it to hover right around that 60% mark. Why? Because that's your labor market. That's what you have out there that you're recruiting from. That's external selection. So when I'm looking at hiring from outside, the question in my head is the composition of our workforce similar to the composition of the labor market? I think that makes sense for most people. What we have in here at our company, does it look like what's out there where we hire from? If we have 90% men in our company and the labor market is 50-50 men, women, and then we go, well, it looks like we lean toward hiring men here in a way that disparately affects female applicants. There could be a ton of reasons for that, right? Types of jobs, stereotype, types of applicants. There could be a lot of reasons, but nonetheless, it would be statistical evidence for adverse impact. That's external. That one's pretty clear. Internal selection is what we apply to everything else, and it has to do with rates. That is percentages. Of those that apply, what percentage of them did you hire or promote, whatever it is? So let's look at an example. So let's say I have, of my female applicants, I don't care if this was 4 female applicants or 400,000. It's rates that we're looking at. 25% of all the women that applied were hired for a job. For my male applicants, 45% of all the men that applied were hired for jobs. So again, we're not looking at number of applicants. We're looking at, of those that applied, at what rate, what percentage did we hire them? So I take that male selection rate of 45%, and I simply, this is the only math, I multiply it times 0.8 or 4/5 to come up with 36%. Okay, that 36% is what you might call, what I refer to as a cutoff rate. It means the selection rate of the majority group here is 45%. The selection rate of the minority group needs to be at least 80% of that. What's that number? 36%. So if I'm selecting women at a rate of less than 36%, that's statistical evidence for adverse impact. If it's higher, then there's not. In this case, I'm selecting women at a rate of 25%. So yes, there is statistical evidence for adverse impact. Of every 100 men that apply, I hire 45. Of every 100 women that apply, I hire 25. That's a big enough gap. It's below the threshold, the 80%, to say, yep, it looks like adverse impact here. There's adverse impact. So that's internal. External selection. So availability analysis, you can get this, quick Google search, census, all kinds of stuff. There's different ways to get it. But it's just the number of people available in the labor market, the composition. What do they look like? Is it 60% men? Is it 40% men? Is it 8% Asian? Is it 80% Asian? What's in the labor market, right? That's what's out there. The utilization analysis is at what rate are we utilizing those groups? Meaning, what do we have in here? Availability is what does it look like out there? Utilization is what do we have in here? So here's an example. African American is 17% of the population, Hispanic 18%, Asian 6%, and American Indian, Alaska Native 4%. Okay, so what we do is we take all those numbers and we multiply them times 0.8, and that gives us the blue bar here on the chart. That in a sense becomes our cutoff rate. So there's 17% African American in the labor market. 80% of that is 13.6%, which means if we are utilizing African Americans, or if we have less than 13.6% African Americans here at our company, that's less than 80% of the availability rate. So what would we expect, by the way? Let's just go here naturally. If there's 17% African American in the workforce or in the labor market, what would you expect at your company? Well, 17%. If that's where we hire from, why wouldn't it be, right? So this gives a little bit, about a 20% wiggle room, but it gives you your cutoff rate. So at this particular company, we are employing, or our our utilization rate for African Americans is at 10%. Of our 500-person company, we have 50 that are African American. Of our 500-person company, we have 75 that are Hispanic, so about 15%. So 4/5 of those availability numbers, right? You can see it in the blue there, gives us our cutoff rate, and it says in this case for African Americans, we are utilizing African Americans at a rate of 10%. The availability is 17%. The cutoff rate is 13.6%. So we go, yes, it looks like you are not hiring African Americans in a way that is similar to, congruent with your labor market. Hispanic is very close, and I'd be watching it and tracking it, but no statistical evidence for adverse impact. So let's do a few examples here. Let's look at the data. Feel free to pause the video if you want to kind of study this and see what's going on. So you can see on the dark blue across the top, we are talking about external selection. So what's out there in the labor market, does it look like what's in here? So when we do that, we're only looking here at one column, and that is the percent available. Not the selection rate, but the percent available first. That's our external tool. So in the labor market, we have 48% men available, 52% women available, and then you can read the other data. American Indian, 2%, Asian, 10%, etc. So what we want to do is say, what is the availability rate for women? It's 52%. Take that number times 0.8. If we are utilizing at a good rate, above that, 52 times 0.8, then we're okay. American Indian, Asian, same thing. And we can see, is there adverse impact in the area of women? The answer is yes. Black and Hispanic, both of them, yes. You can calculate the cutoff rates accordingly by the percent available. So let's look internally, and this is where we spend most of our time. We'll look at salary too, but most of our time is here. So this is just a selection test, okay? So for women, the pass rate of the selection test is 35%. For men, the pass rate is 42%. So we give people a selection test when they come in and apply to the company. 42% of men pass that test, 35% of women pass that test. Let's go down to the next set of data. The pass rate for white. So we always compare majority group to minority group. And that's legal majority, not numerical majority. So I don't care if you have 90% women and 10% men in your company, this test is the same. It has to do with the Civil Rights Law 1964, and then the Uniform Guidelines and Employee Selection Procedures in 1978. So we compare women to men, and we compare every minority group, racial minority group, to white. So our white pass rate for this exam, for this test, of everybody that comes in the company, 68% of the white candidates pass the test. For American Indian, it's 60%. You can read it. 15% for Asian, 43% Hispanic, and 85% Black. So is there adverse impact? Well, we take those pass rates, 42 and 68, and we multiply them times 0.8, and we come up with our cutoff rate. So 42% for men times 0.8 gives us 33.6%. That means women need to pass the test at least a rate of 33.6. Otherwise, the test looks like it might be discriminatory. Moving down, it says that any non-white group would need to pass the test at a rate of 54.4%. Otherwise, it looks like the test is discriminatory. You can see in this case, American Indian, fine. Asian, Black, it's below 80%. It's below the cutoff. The cutoff rate there, 54.4%. So we'd say, yes, there is statistical evidence for adverse impact. Let's look for salary. So we take the average salary for every man in the company and the average salary for every white in the company, and we load them in the majority column, and then we multiply them times 0.8 to get our cutoff rate. Then we take the average salary for women and every minority group, and we compare it to that cutoff rate. We can see in this case the average salary for men is $64,000, $64,351. Multiply that times 0.8, we get a number of $51,480. Women are above this cutoff rate, so it does not look like there is adverse impact in terms of salary. Same thing, we go down the next level of data. We take our white salary average of $57,020, multiply it times 0.8, we get $45,616. That is our cutoff rate. Any average group that's below that would be statistical evidence for adverse impact. Any average group that's above that wouldn't. So you can see in this case, Asian average salary is $34,826. That is below the cutoff of $45,000. So again, for Asian specific. So what does this mean? This means that if a group of our employees that identified as Asian brought a class action lawsuit and says they're not paying us fair, we're being held back on our compensation, when this data is made available, which it will be, the company will probably lose the case, the class action case, because there is statistical evidence that, yeah, why are Asians on average paid so much less than everybody else? And the comparison here is to whites. It needs to be within that 80% rule. So when you're doing this, when you're actually conducting the analysis, ask the question, what am I looking for here? Is this an internal selection thing, like moving people around, or is this an external thing? If it's internal, I'm only looking at rates. Is the selection or promotion or whatever rate of the minority group at least 80% of the selection rate of the majority group? If you got that sentence, then you got everything I'm trying to say. Is the selection rate of the minority group at least 80% of the selection rate of the majority group? That's most of the analysis that we do. We'll do external selection as well, and all that means is, are we utilizing different groups of people at the same rate as their availability out in the labor market, or is it at least within 80% of the same rate? So hopefully that's helpful. If you have questions, again, please let me know. The big thing to keep in mind is why we're doing the math, not what. Again, on average, if I'm promoting someone, if I'm doing promotions, I would expect if my promotion rate for whites is 20%, my promotion rate for everybody else would be around 20%. My promotion rate for men is at 15%. My promotion rate for women should be around 15%. If it's at least if the rate of the minority group is at least 80% of the rate of the majority group, then you're probably okay. If not, you got to figure out where the disconnect is. What's happening? Is it a bias issue? Is it a policy issue? Is it a procedures issue? Like, what's actually happening, so you can, again, close that gap.